Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm delighted to be talking here tonight to the Offaly Historical Society. I think I spoke first to them here, to yourselves here, nearly 40 years ago, I think, back in the 80s, I think, anyhow. And I remember meeting a man here, Jimmy Fanning, who was he was editor of the Midland Tribune and proprietor, I think, but he had actually introduced my mother and father in Tullamore. They were both working in Tullamore during the war, and father in customs and excise. My mother's a poultry instructress, so that's how I'm here today. So I'm going to be talking about Clonmacnoise today, and particularly about the churches at Clonmacnoise and their history, architectural history, archaeology, who built them, when and why, and what we can work out from their names, etc., in more recent times. Some of what I'm saying is going to be a certain amount of speculation. We have to speculate a bit sometimes, working with the facts that are available. And what's important about Clonmacnoise and its churches, etc., is its position on the border of the province of Connacht and the province of Midde, which was in the centre of Ireland, and the royal patronage that's involved in the building of these churches over time, and how it oscillated between Connacht and Midde or Meath over time. So my involvement with Clonmacnoise goes back to about 1985, when I excavated under the toilet block there and did some other testing work. And then I did some excavation also in 1989-90. And after that, we sort of developed quite a backlog of unpublished excavations. So we had to hand over to other people. And Heather King, some of you might remember Heather King, here over on the left there, she took over excavating at Clonmacnoise and excavated at the new graveyard and did some work, very interesting work too, under the high crosses, when the high crosses were being moved. So, and she got very interested in Clonmacnoise and was there for quite a good lot of the 1990s during the summer, carrying out this excavation. And she also set up these Clonmacnoise seminars, which were held in, 1984 and 1994, and 1998. And those two were published in these volumes. And at the first of those seminars, I had written a little guidebook to Clonmacnoise up on the left there, and it was launched at that first seminar. And that's a picture from the launch there with Heather, myself, Brian Cowan, and Tom Moore, who was the guide at Clonmacnoise for many years and only retired last year. So that's where my interest in Clonmacnoise developed over the years, and I got interested in the churches. And when I was writing the guidebook, I was trying to make sense of some of the churches that got me interested in the cathedral, etc. So, moving on then, we're very lucky to have some extraordinary old maps of Clonmacnoise. And the earliest one is over on the left there. It's in the Bodleian Library, I think. It's a sketch plan that was done by or for the Bishop of Meath at the time, who was James Usher, the famous James Usher. And it shows all the churches and gives their names, which was very interesting. The cathedral is called Temple MacDermot. what we call Temple Fingan today, with a little round tower attached to it, Temple Finian. And he also shows here now, which one is it? Yeah, this one here, I think. Things are always upside down. Or here, it's Temple Horpen anyhow. It's something will come up again later. And based on that was this print of Clonmacnoise done by Wenceslas Haller in London. Oops. Sorry about that. You see his name here. For Ware's book on the antiquities of Ireland, published in 1658. And Haller worked from this drawing or from another copy of it, but turned it the other way around. And the way the buildings look there, it's like he did it like a bird's eye view. It's totally imaginary because he was just working from a plan. And proof of that is the fact that the round tower was shown as a little kick out, and he completely misunderstood it here and showed it as if it was a funny little projection of the wall of the graveyard, whereas in fact that was meant to be a round tower. But it's a very interesting plan, but based on this, so the information on it goes back to 1621. The next plan we have then is in the later edition of Ware's work, Harris's edition from the mid-18th century, and was a man called Blamires was sent to Clonmacnoise to draw some of the buildings, show a sort of a landscape view of them here. And he did a new plan, possibly partly using this, but also picking up new information as he went along. And that was in 1737. I'll just show that in a bit more detail. But first of all, looking at this plan here, you can see what we call Temple Dowling had a roof on it. I think you possibly can see it there. And you might be able to see here that the tiny church, Temple Ciarán, some of the timbers of the roof, oh no, here it is here, timbers of the roof are still visible. So it had been roofed up to close enough to that time, presumably. So just moving on then to a better view of this one, you can see in Ware's plan, this what he called Temple Horpen is here now called Temple Dowling, or a parish church, because it was roofed. It was, I'll be talking about it in a minute. It was done up by this man and extended. Edmund Dowling of Clondelar, as a plaque on the church says. And so that's there. And B here is Temple Horpen, or MacLaffy's church. He's wrong in calling it Temple Horpen. Temple Horpen, this is going a bit funny on me, sorry. He's wrong in calling it Temple Horpen. It's MacLaffy's church because it's added since that 1621, and it's in existence at this stage. And Temple Horpen was the original bit of M here. So that's a little bit complicated there. Temple MacDermot is the cathedral here, number C. And what's interesting is that for the first time here we get McCarthy being mentioned in relation to what we call Temple Fingan. We can see it here. And in this, it's called Temple Fingan, or McCarthy's church, and then the tower even is called McCarthy's Tower. Of course, it's all part of one building. something's going to come up as well. And he also names the round tower as O'Rourke's Tower. So just interesting what the names they put on the churches, etc. Now, here we have a more modern plan of the church, and I corrected it. Initially I was calling that Temple Hurpin, but it's MacLaffy's church. The other is Temple Dowling, incorporating the older Temple Hurpin. A view from the from the top of the round tower here, showing the cathedral, Temple Ciarán, Temple Dowling and MacLaffy's church and the other ones. And you can see the crosses here then, South Cross, Cross of the Scriptures, and I think this is the North Cross, just it's missing its top for a long time. Thing to notice here is on the plan, there's a different alignment between the cathedral and Temple Ciarán. You can see the alignment there, the alignment here. And also thing to notice that I'll be bringing up about the churches is what's called ante. And these are projections of the side walls beyond the end wall. You can see it here like a pilaster, if you like. And the churches that have that in the main graveyard are the cathedral, Temple Ciarán, and also Temple Dowling here, or Temple Hurpin as it was originally. So moving on to the cathedral then. Sorry, we just have one. This is Temple Ciarán here first. And you can see the oldest parts of it here are what's shown in black. The rest has been reconstructed. You can see it here, that ante there, anta, that corner, the doorway here, which is a round top. And when they were working on the buildings there in the 1950s, they found this jamstone of the doorway here. And when they took it, it had decoration on the side of it. And when they took it out, it was this wonderful piece of carving. And some people have thought it was Romanesque, 12th century, some more about 800. I think it has to be about 800 because this building dates from about 900. And so it must have been broken and just used as a building stone already by 800. And one of the reasons the alignment of this building is different from the others is that there was this feature under it inside. This was excavated in the 1950s. Nothing was found in it at the time. And it would have been under an older timber church. And this is how its alignment then varied from the other buildings because they were following this, and it was regarded as the burial place of St. Ciarán. Probably it was called Labba Ciarán. You have a similar thing with Declan's Church in Ardmore in County Waterford. So moving on then to the cathedral. This is quite an extraordinary building in many ways, and things to notice initially are of course the ante. Also, the fact that the doorway, which replaced the original doorway, there's no doubt about that. There would have been probably a lintel doorway originally. This one dates from around 1200. And it's off-centre completely. You can see it here in the... And I was trying to work that out when I was writing the guidebook. And I came to the conclusion eventually that the south wall of the church was rebuilt and moved at some stage, probably because the original, which must have been out here, failed in some way, and they decided to rebuild it, but they moved it in by about 2 meters. And this caused the doorway to end up off-centre. Why they moved it in, I don't know. Probably it would have been easier to roof this, the building, a narrower, slightly narrower building. And that was done sometime like I think around 1300 or so. So it's a complicated building in some ways. The other early feature of it, if you like, the ante is an early feature, the door position, but not that particular door. And also, if you look at the stonework here, you can see it's fairly small stones, but you can see these holes in the wall. They go right through the wall, and they're putlog holes. They were connected with scaffolding when they were building the building. They went up so high, put a timber through, and then they could hold a platform on that for the next bit of building, and they went up again with each lift. You might notice too that the stonework from there up is different. And I think that's a second phase of the building, probably when this doorway went in. And the original, these are old pre-Romanesque churches, had very steep gables. And later builders liked a less steep gable. And so they built up the side walls sometimes to go up at a less steep angle. And that's what I think happened in that case. Now the building, the original building was 10.7 meters wide internally and 18.8 meters long. Its proportions were 1 to 1.75 or so. And as such, it's the largest pre-Romanesque church in Ireland, just somewhat larger than the cathedral at Glendalough. Of course, a lot of other sites like Armagh, Kells, etc. must have had very important churches built in stone also, but they don't survive, you know, but it has survived here. Pre-Romanesque churches in Ireland, stone-built ones, are they're always very plain. They're plain rectangular buildings without a separate chancel or anything like that, or aisles or transepts or anything. They always have a west door centrally placed. They had a very limited number of windows, usually one in the east wall and one at the east end of the south wall. And that was pretty much it. So that's and the earliest ones have ante, and the earlier they are, the deeper the ante, which is something that will come up in a minute also. So, this is just a drawing here that shows where that original wall was. You can see the doorway would have been central. These are later features here. And Liam de Puer did some excavation at Clonmacnoise in the 1950s, and all we have is some photographs from it. And he put a cutting in here, and he actually found the wall. But it wasn't recognized entirely for what it was. And you can see it had plaster on the outside. And this original, the sacristy that was there, was originally added while that wall was still there. So when they moved the wall, they had to fill in a little bit there. Now, we have good evidence for the date of this church in the annals. The annals record that in 909, King Flann Shinna, he was a Midda, O'Melachlan, I suppose, king, and Colman, who was the abbot of Clonmacnoise, that they built what's called the Dowling of Clonmacnoise. And Dowling meant stone church, basically. And this is certainly that building. And he was celebrating the fact that he could call himself King of Ireland for the first time, probably, because the year before, 908, he had defeated Cormac MacQuillenan, the king of Munster, in the Battle of Ballachmuna. Here's a more recent picture called King Cormac MacQuillenan. He was the King Bishop of Munster, and he was killed in the battle. So Flann was pretty much King of Ireland at that stage. And the same two names, Flann Sinna and Colman, appear to be in the inscription on the cross of the scriptures. So that is probably produced around the same time. And this panel on the cross of the scriptures has been differently interpreted by different people. Peter Harbison was very tied to regarding all of these images as being biblical. And he had an interpretation of this as it's called the interpretation of the dream of Pharaoh's butler. I was never terribly convinced by it, to be given such prominent position on a cross. Other people have always thought that it signified King Flann and Cormac, where's it? Cormac, yeah. No, Connor, sorry. Getting mixed up here now. The abbot of Clonmacnoise, anyhow. Colman. And that there could have been a harking back to Ciarán and the King of Midda, King of Ireland at the time, on this also back in the 5th century. And I think that's quite likely in lots of ways. And Roger Stalley, who's another great expert on high crosses and on early medieval art in Ireland, he believes that. And so in the next one, I'll just show you some other images that might relate or give you an idea. So up there you can see the panel of the cross of the scriptures, and this is a panel on a cross from Essen in Germany, and it's slightly later than the cross of the scriptures, but it's just to illustrate this idea of two people holding a cross or a staff. And in this case, it seems to be more a staff. Here you can see it's a cross, and it's Duke Otto and Abbess Matilda. So you could see it as cooperation between church and state. And if you look at Byzantine coinage of different dates from around that period, there's quite a few with holding a staff, both with their hands on it. In this case, it's an angel and one of the leaders of Byzantium. Here you have two who shared kingship, and there are other ones over here also. And here's a panel from a church in England, at Landford, I think it is, and you can see very similar thing here. They interpret it as the finding of the true cross with Helen and Constantine or something. But to me, it looks like two men, but it's hard to make out in this case. But I think it's maybe something else signifying church and state working together. So moving on then to Temple Dowling, was that other one I mentioned. The white here is the original bit, and this was Temple Horpen and was shown as just that shape in 1621. Edmund Dowling of Clondelar extended it, and he rebuilt the ante. You can see them there. In 1689, during the period of James II. So a Catholic king and the Catholics in the area rebuilding the church. It then gets used as a parish church by the established church. And then this bit is MacLaffy's church, added on sometime before 1737, before Blamires did his plan of the site, etc. So you can see here, those other churches I spoke about with ante, they were deeper ante. These ones are very shallow. They're only sticking out maybe a few inches. The other churches then had putlog holes and fairly small stones. There's quite large stones used in this building. You can see here the original east window, and there would have been another window here. And where the church was extended, you can see here where the original west end was. That was part of the ante at that point. So this church then, I think, is slightly later. We have our dates for the date for the cathedral, 909. I think Temple Ciarán is very similar in every way and must be around the same date. And here, I think we're probably dealing with later, around 1000 or a bit later. Probably, you know, a good 100 years later. So Heather carried out some very interesting excavations under the crosses. The crosses were moved into the new visitor centre back in the 1990s. And you can see here Heather herself, just when the South Cross was moved, she found a cross slab under it. This is the North Cross. We're fairly certain that the North Cross, very certain, wasn't in its original position, because when she dug under the other crosses, she found undisturbed ground under them. No later disturbance, whereas under this there was quite modern burials from the last 200-300 years anyhow. So under both the Cross of the Scriptures and the South Cross, and this is under the Cross of the Scriptures, she found evidence of that there had been a large timber beam, if you like, or upright set in the ground there. And the most reasonable explanation for that is that there was a wooden cross there before the stone cross. And we have good evidence for that in some of the crosses in Henny and places are very clearly translations into stone of wooden crosses. So we can accept that. And if you look then at the layout of the crosses, they form a nice triangle. And just assuming that the North Cross was originally here, it certainly wasn't at this point. And there could have been another cross at the back. And some of those plans show a cross somewhere out here. So there seems to have been a geometric layout of Clonmacnoise at some stage with the crosses and the cathedral. But the fact that right under those stone crosses there's evidence for a wooden cross, it would indicate that that was all done in timber originally, and that it was updated in stone eventually. And I found something similar then at Monaster Boyce in County Louth, and there you have Murdoch's Cross, the West Cross and the North Cross, again forming a sort of triangle here. And this church has some early features, but it seems to have been smaller than that originally. That door is quite old. This is a later church here, And I think there must have been a timber church working with these crosses, and that it may have survived right up to the 13th century. And that's something we forget sometimes, that there must have been extraordinary timber buildings in Ireland that don't survive. And I think there was a timber cathedral, if you like, here before the stone one of 909. So, and we have very good evidence of a high quality of carpentry in Ireland back from around at least the 7th century or so. It's been found, very good carpentry has been found in horizontal mills that have been dug up in all over the country, really. And then at Clonmacnoise itself, evidence for this bridge, extraordinary bridge across the river, built in 804, and we know that date from dendrochronological analysis of some of the timbers. And it was an extraordinary engineering achievement, because this wasn't a flat bed on the river here at all. It goes across and it drops in the middle and goes up again. And how they drove each of these uprights down into the river accurately the man who did it must have been an extraordinary engineer, no doubt about it. I wondered, was he the same man who built the original wooden church and the wooden crosses here on this site? And at that time, probably the most powerful king in the area was a king of Connacht, and his name was Murius MacTumiltig, and he promoted the law of Ciarán over Connacht, and he cooperated too with the abbot who was there at the time, Farcalach Fovert, he was from Fore in County Westmeath. And I think he laid out the whole site in a geometric way. But this is speculation. You can't prove it. And the other point, I think, what happened then, the different crosses, wooden crosses weren't going to survive very long in the Irish climate outdoors. And this one was probably replaced quite quickly. The North Cross probably dates from around the early 9th century, so not long after that. South Cross is probably about the middle of the 9th century, and then we have the Cross of the Scriptures, possibly close to 909. And then when Flann went to build his cathedral, what I think he did was that he moved the original timber church over here. And we get references to and the word that's used in the annals for timber churches is Darteach, which means oak house. And there's a reference to the oak house getting burnt in 1090 something. And then there's a reference that O'Kelly built his church here in 1167 on the site of the Darteach. So I think that it must have been a very fine timber church, was moved to one side and the stone church built. And these timber churches were timber frame buildings. They could be taken apart and re-erected. You see quite a lot of them on the continent and in Britain, but we don't have them surviving so much in Ireland. Looking at a couple of things here, just that very idea of ante. I found this plan of a Neolithic house going back, about 3000 BC or something more. And you can see it has that feature. And one of the reasons you would extend the side walls out is to completely cover the gable walls. And in any timber building, having eaves coming out quite a lot is important to keep the water off the wooden walls. Here's a timber church from Scandinavia, and you can see to some element of the sides here extending a bit to support this, these barge boards, if you like, coming over the gable. Another is just a farm building, but hundreds of years old, in the folk park in Oslo, and you can see the side walls brought out again and the roof brought right over. Unfortunately, this is the sort of building we would have had in Ireland without its extension here as a wooden church before the stone churches were built, the Dartach. And archaeologically, we haven't found evidence for any of them for the simple reason that the timber beam here was above the ground and had a low dry stone wall underneath. And we haven't been lucky enough to find that anywhere yet. On the Pharaohs here, you can see where they found it in excavating under a more modern church, and they found the remains of this stone wall underneath. Its later timber church had a little chancel here, but that's something we still have to find in Ireland. So moving on then to the Romanesque. So the churches we've been speaking about there now, in 804 you had the King of Connacht building in timber probably and setting up that whole geometric pattern. And then the King of Meath, the Kings of Meath became more important at Clonmacnoise around the middle of the century. And you have Mael Shocklin the first coming along around the middle of the 10th century, well, middle of the 9th century, sorry. And later on again, then you have Connacht coming back again in the 12th century. The nuns' church here in the 12th century was actually built by someone with connections with Midde, and that was Dervergille, the famous Dervergille. She built the nuns' church in 1167. And but then again, she was married to Tiernan O'Rourke, who was closely allied with Connacht. And I think there were two nuns' churches really at Clonmacnoise, something I'll bring up in a minute. This is an old plan done by one of the founders of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, now the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland. This is back from the 1860s or so, and you can see the nuns' church here, and he carried out the conservation of it because that arch had actually fallen and did it very well indeed. But he must have done some digging as well, because he found another church that isn't in evidence anymore. It may be under the under the sward there, but it's a church with ante again, so it seems to be an early church. But this is your 12th century one, with very fine Hiberno-Romanesque work around the doorway and the chancel arch. The other very interesting Romanesque church is Temple Fingen, and it's probably also built around the 1160s. The other interesting feature here is the round tower, and we know that was built, again a reference in the annals, in 1124 by Thurlough O'Connor, King of Connacht, and the abbot at the time, who was Muelone and Malone. See a plan here of this church, and a lot of printer's ink was wasted in the 19th century over whether the round tower was there and whether the church was added to it or whatever, but in fact they were built at the same time. But there is probably a connection in that this was built by Turlough O'Connor, who was a very powerful king. It was hit by lightning in 1135 and the top knocked off it. I think about half it was knocked off it, as you'll see in the next picture. And you'd expect if there was a lot of stonework around that, you'd find it in the walls or reused in some of the churches. I think they reused it in building this round tower at Temple Fingen. And the other point about it is that I think this was a second nuns' church with connections with Connacht in this case. And I'll present that bit of evidence now. So this amalgam of the two would show what that round tower possibly looked like, or something of what it might have looked like originally here in the middle, with the stones from this used there originally. Now, and it was Ken Nichols pointed this out first. There is a document from a papal bull from 1195 that shows that there were two nuns' churches at Clonmacnoise. And it was the Church of St. Mary of Clonmacnoise to the east, with the settlement of Kilogeenahan and its appurtenances. Now, that was the nuns' church that we know. It was Dervergilla, one of the O'Melachlans from Midda, who paid for it. And Kilogeenahan is on that side of the river. And then the Church of St. Mary to the west, with the settlement at Dromalga and its appurtenances. And my case is that this is Temple Fingen, and that it's patronized by Connacht, someone from Connacht. We just don't have any reference to this. And Dromalga is in County Roscommon on that side of the river. And then another papal bull from 1223 just has St. Mary at Clonmacnoise, which is this, and St. Mary at Dromalga. The nuns had left Clonmacnoise, and I'll present some of that evidence now in the next one. Because they left because the place was being raided so seriously, especially by the Normans. 1179, 105 houses were burnt there. 1200, Mylor Fitzhenry spent 2 days raiding. 1202, William Burke raided twice in 1 week. And 1206, 47 houses burnt and part of the cathedral. And there's evidence of burning on Temple Fingen. I think the nuns got fed up and went to what was their grange or farm at Dromalga, and they survived there up to the dissolution. So how does it get its name? McCarthy's Church, McCarthy's Tower. I think it's from one of the McCarthys, and even the name Fingen, I think, comes from that too. And the reason was, around this time, as reflected in a strange document that we only have in an English translation called the Registry of Clonmacnoise, there seems to have been an attempt to promote Clonmacnoise as a place of burial for all the old important families of Ireland. And the McCarthys are mentioned, and according to this document, they gave lands and properties in Munster to Clonmacnoise. And then the O'Kellys are listed, other people are listed. And this man here was King of Desmond from 1206 to 9. He was an ally of Cathal Crovdearg O'Connor. Um, and I think Cathal Crovdearg was behind some of this promotion of Clonmacnoise at that stage. The bishop at the time was a man called Murdoch Murdocane. And in 1208, Cathal Crovdearg, well, I think it must have been him, enshrined the bones of his own brother Rory O'Connor on the site. And we have a reference in the annals. It doesn't say Cathal Crovdearg did it, but it says that that Rory O'Connor was translated, is the word they used. They dug him up. He was only buried about 9 years, I think. And he was put into a stone shrine. And this is the first stage, if you like, of canonizing someone. And Rory O'Connor was no saint, but that didn't matter. So that's what they were doing. And I think he was promoting this thing of different Gaelic families burying there, and this is how the McCarthys get their name attached to that church, which had been, I think, a nun's church. So that's, you have it there. And this, the remains of Dromalga nunnery are still there in County Roscommon. Not very much left or very much to see, but parts of the walls still standing there. And I say it remained a nunnery until the dissolution. Now, this whole enshrinement of Rory O'Connor, I think the church must have been done up at the same time, but it was probably damaged in some of those raids. And this west doorway is of that period, generally. Also, the original sacristy was added at that time, and this strip of building here on the north wall was added too. One stone that I found digging in what's called the steeple garden, where the visitor centre is now, is this little stone here. It was half a circular column, but it was never circular. It actually went into flat. It was just semicircular. And a shrine in a place in Wales called Pennant Melangal, you do get this sort of little column, just half a column, that's full circle there, but against the altar bit was this half column. You can see it there. And I think this might have been from that, and this stone shrine mentioned in the annals for Rory O'Connor might have looked something like this, but it's a lot to build on one small stone. But that's what we're dealing with sometimes. So very soon after all that, the Henry of London, the Justiciar of Ireland, built a castle at Clonmacnoise, 1214, and that was the end of O'Connor influence at that stage at Clonmacnoise. So Cathal Crovdearg's work was all pretty much in vain at that stage. And when he died himself in, I think, the early 1220s, he was buried not with his father and his brother in the cathedral at Clonmacnoise, but at Abbey-Knockmoy in County Galway, Cistercian Abbey he had founded himself, probably because he didn't have any influence here anymore. So looking at some of the other churches from the early 13th century, we have Temple Ree or Temple Melachlan here, connected with the old kings of Meath. And built in the style, what's called sometimes the School of the West. These windows with lovely frames around them. And it may be connected with that whole development of Clonmacnoise as this burial place, and maybe the O'Malachlans were built this for themselves for that reason. And something we can see here is that I spoke about the ante being very deep originally in the 10th century, much shallower then, just after 1,000 or so, and then getting replaced by corbels, which carried the barge boards of the ends of the roof over the gable. And on this church you can see that, the corbel there and a corbel there. The other church that has some features from this period is Temple Connor, which is the little church that is still roofed and used by the Church of Ireland. And that doorway is certainly of that period. But there's funny things about this church, and I haven't really succeeded in making sense of it. Like, there is a relieving arch here over the door, but it's not centered over the door, which is strange. And the window there could be earlier. You'd expect in a church of around 1200 fairly fine cornerstones, and you don't get that. So there may be other things happening here which I don't understand yet. I might at some stage, but I'm not sure. Moving on then, there was the cathedral had a big renovation carried out in 1460 or so. And it was the dean who was there at the time, Dean Odo O'Malone. And I think he had the cooperation of Clonmacnoise MacDiarmada from Connacht. And that is why I think the cathedral is known as MacDermot's Church on those early plans we looked at towards the start. So what was done at this stage was a new north doorway added here, and this is it here, a beautiful piece of work, late Gothic Irish work. The whole east end of the building was vaulted, and you can see the pillars here to hold it. That it's collapsed now, but there's still the responds are there. There's a little carving of a sheep here, just at that point there. And the doorway has an inscription saying it was Dean Odo had me made, and we know he was around about 1460. And there's beautiful carving on it. It's called the Whispering Arch sometimes. And it's interesting that the three saints that are shown here, and again their names are written up, so there's no doubt about it, they're actually carved just above them, with St. Patrick in the middle, St. Francis on this side, and St. Dominic on this side. And you think, very strange, why isn't Ciarán there? Ciarán, who is the founder of Clonmacnoise. And I think it's something to do with the sort of culture of religion at the time. The mendicant orders had become very powerful and very influential. The Franciscans, Augustinians, Dominicans, and you even look at the poetry they were writing, and they don't mention Irish saints at all. It's mainly European saints. You know, you have Francis, Dominic, and then you have Michael the Archangel, Catherine, and the apostles. And if you look at the tombs, especially the ones in around Offaly, And up in Dublin itself, you get the apostles. It's very seldom you get an Irish saint shown. So I think that might be reflected a bit in this. And also, this was a very poor diocese at this stage, and it was mainly mendicants that took up the bishoprics at different times. And it was a Franciscan, I think, who was bishop at the time, Dean Odo, had this door made back in 1460. So after all that work then, 1460, and they fitted in a room over the sacristy with a fireplace. There was actually a room over this as well, and he was setting up a college of canons there, and maybe they lived in some of those rooms. By 1516, the whole place was in ruin again, and this is before the dissolution, before the wars of the 16th century. And I just got a document. Where's that? It's Dean Odo, really. There's an account of when they wanted to appoint, it was Henry VIII. It's before the dissolution, 1516, before the Reformation. He was recommending this, it's not me, this Franciscan, Quintinus O'Higgins, as Bishop of Clonmacnoise. And they wanted information in Rome on him, whether he was a good enough candidate, and they wanted information about Clonmacnoise. And a man called Nicholas Howran, is the way it's put, said he was connected with Ardfert, and he must have been in Rome already. He gave his testimony, and it says, having been asked, this is translated from the Latin, having been asked about the true state of the church, he answered thus: in the island of Ireland, in the east of the province of Tuam, which is wrong, of course, it wasn't in the province of Tuam, province of ecclesiastical province of Armagh, situated among forests in the city of Clun, some 12 wattle and daub huts. That's what Clonmacnoise was reduced to, close to which a certain river flows from a cataract, which is called Shannon, in their language. And it is located a day's journey from the sea. You'd want to be on a horse. It has, from the left part facing west, a ruined cathedral without a roof, with just one small altar roofed with thatch. And I think that might have been, they might have been able to thatch with a lean-to roof over that vaulted east end. One cheap set of service vessels and a bronze cross, a single bell tower with 2 bells, that was the round tower, and a little sacristy, that was there, of the value of 33 ducats, which comes from grain and barley whence beer is made. And he sort of repeats most of this, but he adds a little bit, Mass is rarely celebrated. In this church is the body of one Irish saint, of whose name the witness was ignorant. How did this man not know Ciarán was the saint? But maybe it was part of that whole mendicant thing where they were looking at universal saints, if you like, and under whose dedication the church is. So that was that document, and I got it translated from the Latin recently because it's in a very obscure book, and I hope to publish it soon enough. So that's extraordinary that before the dissolution and everything, that Clonmacnoise had come to that. And there is a record in the Annals of the Four Masters in 1555 that the English garrison from Athlone came there and did terrible damage. But it strikes me most of the damage was done already, and a lot of it was the Irish chiefs, the MacCochlans around Clonmacnoise, they sort of monopolised the positions like bishop and everything else. And that whole account with Quintinus O'Higgins being appointed, approved by the church and by the king, he turned up and he was turned away. They wouldn't have him. He wasn't local. He wasn't a MacCochlan, or a Malone would probably have got in all right. And he spent the rest of his time with the title Bishop of Clonmacnoise, administering down in Connor. And another man who was appointed to Ardagh went to Ardagh. The O'Farrells wouldn't have him. So he ended up, because he was a Malone, he went to Clonmacnoise, and a descendant of his, and he would have had the title Bishop of Ardagh, but he administered Clonmacnoise, and a descendant of his referred to himself as being a grandson of Rory O'Malone, Bishop of Clonmacnoise. So, the Irish chiefs didn't help the condition of these churches at that stage in the 15th, 16th century. So you get an idea of the sort of importance of royal patronage at these sites, and that oscillation between Connacht and Meath, and the way at this stage by 1516 the decline of these churches was probably due to the Irish chiefs at that stage. So, thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of ascetic monks, other than mendicants, kind of being the reason why they were different.
St. Ciarán was an early, very early saint, 5th century. The mendicants only come in the 13th century, really. But, some of the early monks were ascetic as well in different ways. So I didn't really go into all that at all, because I was concentrating on the churches, But
So I just wonder if you must have cheers on top of the arch, but there's no mention of the founder, was there kind of a rivalry, jealousy, or however, just ignore them?
It's a hard thing to know. And then it changes in the 17th century. You have the people who wrote the Annals of the Four Masters. They got interested in history, in the saints' lives, saints' genealogies, everything like that again. But I think sometime in the 15th and 16th century, the Franciscans mightn't have been interested in the older saints and looking more to what was important in the universal church.
I always thought that it was because the Dominicans, when the Normans came to Ireland, they brought the orders came after them, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and I thought that they were popular at that time, and that's why they used them. The Dominicans and Franciscans would have been popular, so they used St. Francis and St. Dominic.
Yeah, they were popular. Yeah, they were definitely popular. They came in just on the coattails of the Normans, sort of afterwards, in the early 13th century. And also there developed then a more stricter version of both, and of the Augustinians as well, which were sometimes connected with the Gaelic Irish, more observant Franciscans. And the original Franciscans, there's another word for them, they were mainly in the Norman towns, and they mightn't have been very interested in Irish saints. Like, there was great interest in Irish saints especially among the Augustinian canons founded in the 12th, 13th century, that sort of period. And I think there might have been a falling off of interest in the official Irish church anyhow. Probably there was always local interest in the saints, and that it only revives then possibly in the 17th century with Colgan and O'Clery and all these people, mainly Franciscans, collecting all this information again, saints, the lives of the saints, and the annals of the Four Masters, of course, as well. Yeah.
So what is known of the original settlement by St. Ciarán and the dates for that? Is there very little information on that period?
There's very little information on that period. You know, what you're seeing at the site is all some hundreds of years later, you know.
Yes, and is that the same over all monastic settlements that happened in Ireland at that time?
Yeah.
You speak of Iona, Columkill,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, because the churches, the houses, everything were built of perishable material. Originally built probably post and wattle and sod in some cases, and then from about sometime in the 8th century they were building these big wooden churches, and I think they must have been extraordinary buildings, but we just haven't found the evidence for them. They're mentioned in the annals and called Dartach and all that sort of word. And then around 900 or 800 on, anyhow, they start replacing them in stone, but mainly at more important sites. So I think.
What approximate date can we give for Ciarán founding this first settlement there?
Oh, we know pretty much when it was. It's in around the 540s or something like that.
540s.
Yeah, I mean, his death date is given in the annals, and he was supposed to have only been there for 3 years at that stage, something like that. So we know pretty much when it was founded, but nothing you're seeing there is as old as that.
And the Norman castle down towards St. Ciarán as well. When was it?
1214 or so it was
A
built.
Norman castle.
A Norman castle, yeah.
How long did that? I climbed over that castle as a child,
Yeah.
and I never knew the history of it. So, what have you any idea about the brief history of that castle? Then?
I do, yeah. I wrote it up in one of those with Ciarán O'Connor, one of those Clonmacnoise study 2. We know there are mentions of it in the Norman documents, sort of into the mid to later 13th century, I think, and then it's sort of there's no mention after that, and there's no interference by the king in the appointment of bishops of Clonmacnoise from then on. So I think the Gaelic revival saw to the end of it, and I think it was undermined by some of the Melachlans or MacCochlans, probably in the late 13th century.
Was there a Norman name there of other Norman lord built it?
No, it was built by the Justiciar of Ireland, who was also Archbishop of Dublin,
Oh, yes, it's now
Henry of London.
Yes.
And he built it as a royal castle. So that
Yes.
it would have been appointed, you know, the governor of it or whatever would have been appointed. And there's mention of that just 2 or 3 times over the next few decades. And then you hear nothing. So it wasn't a lord who was setting up a castle
Yes,
there.
yes, we left it.
Yeah.
Name it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I want to ask, and I could be totally wrong, there's a crozier of Clonmacnoise, which I think is in the British Museum. Do you know anything about it?
I know the closure of Clonmacnoise, yeah. Is it in the British Museum or where is it now?
It's certainly not in Ireland. It is in Dublin now that I think about it.
Yeah, it
Maybe it's
might be in Dublin.
Museum.
There was a story at one stage that it was found in that stone sort of grave or whatever you want to call it under Temple Ciarán, but it wasn't. There's no evidence that it was buried in the ground for any length of time. It must have been somewhere locally. Someone must have held on to it right through, and then in the 19th century it appears again and ends up in a but this full story isn't known.
My second thing is you did a tremendous speech. I really enjoyed it.
And I often wondered about the wooden structures in Ireland and thought they must be good. And your mention of the windmills, or not the windmills, but the water mills. But even the Viking thing saying 105 houses were burned, that means there was a substantial, and they were all in wooden and clay and wattle and things.
Post and wattle.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You started off your talk and you mentioned in the first couple of sentences the word speculation. And I'm just wondering what talk afterwards and everything else, excellent as it was, without archaeology, would we know anything about the early church? Because if it was all wooden and would we now be talking to you here at all if there wasn't archaeology? Would you be talking about Clonmacnoise?
Yeah, I think archaeology has given us a lot of information, all right, over the years. I mean, you have the annals and all of that, but to get some idea of what the buildings were like. And they have found evidence for very insubstantial sort of wattle and sod buildings. At Liam de Puer got it at Inishcaltra, and they got it as well Ilon Loughan down beside Portmagee in Kerry. Just little small buildings, and a few other places, and sometimes earth-fast timber. And of course, earth-fast timber is a bad idea because the timbers rot in the ground, whereas those timber frame buildings, you had the base plate up on a little dry stone wall, and they have survived in Scandinavia, some of them for 1,000 years. Now it's colder there, obviously, and that helps a bit, and we have lost them all, and we still haven't found the evidence for any of them, but we can remain hopeful.
I also know the Book of Rahan, which is a combination with other books and in the Bodleian Library, as you probably know. But Petrie wrote about it in his book on round towers or ecclesiastical buildings. And in it he mentions a Jirtok, which you mentioned, but in Rahan, and it was made from 1,000 planks of wood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, it's speculation. The wood would be gone. Where is it? Where was it?
Yeah.
But he actually mentions in that there.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I must check that again.
I'll talk to you about it later.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Now, I was just wondering when you said about, I was looking a bit about the history of the bishops of Clonmacnoise as distinct from the Celtic monastery. And I think the last, we say, resident bishop would have been Sean O'Dowling.
Yeah.
And he died about 1478 or 1480 or so. Mm-hmm. And all the bishops after that were royal appointees, as the Pope, before the Reformation, appointed them as favours for the King of England, mm-hmm. who wanted to give a job to some boys as a favour. And none of them appeared to be resident. So might it be the fact that they weren't resident, because the fact that they were attempted to be parachuted in, that's why the local people wouldn't accept them. The local, we say, chapter and dean, who would have been in existence, and traditionally would have elected the bishop, subject to royal confirmation, of course. But then suddenly, when they found these, Blake, I think, was one name, and a few others, and even I remember coming across recently that even Archbishop Cranmer was giving out about the fact that one of them wouldn't even go to his diocese.
Yeah, I think you have a point there. That certainly makes sense. And it's only then at that stage that I've come across the King of England, Henry VIII especially, getting involved that much. For a long time they hadn't. And he was getting involved in places where he hadn't even control. Now, it might have been the Earls of Kildare, who were important at the time, were pushing some of these people and thought they'd get them in by getting the king to write to the Pope and say, this man's a good man, he should be
Back in
bishop.
the 13th century and in the 14th century, they used to just rubber stamp whoever the chapter
Yeah.
elected, and they would look for royal permission and would always be given, and they'd restore the temporalities to them immediately, and it was a matter of rubber stamp. But after Sean O'Dowling, I think,
Yeah.
they seem to have directly said, we will require a favour, bypass the chapter, write to the Pope, and of course the Pope would be anxious to humour Henry VIII, whatever about the local people feeling, and immediately he'd rubber stamp, if you want him as bishop. Some of them then, I don't think after 1480, that any of the bishops actually resided there anymore.
Oh yeah, well, they couldn't get in because the locals wouldn't have them. And the McCaughlan's had a bit of a stranglehold on it. And earlier in the 15th century, there's a reference to this Bishop McCaughlin. And the Anns of the Four Masters just say, Bishop, whatever is McCormack or something, McCaughlin died. But if you look at the book of Lecan, there's a much fuller account.
He was killed in a battle.
He got involved in a battle among the McCaughlins about the next leader, and he was killed. His son, who was the archdeacon, was killed, and two of the archdeacon's sons were killed.
Grandson, I think, went over to Rome to try and become bishop as well, but got turned down.
So,
Lovely talk there, Con. Thank you very much. Could you say a couple of short words on the geology of Clonmacnoise and the buildings, the mixture of limestone and sandstone, and particularly in relation to the high crosses and where it might have come from?
yeah. The earliest two buildings, the cathedral and the Temple Ciarán, they're built mainly with sandstone. I think it's sandstone from Bloom Hill. There's a lot of erratics of sandstone. You can still see them there in the townland of Bloom Hill, which is just north of Clonmacnoise. And they were used a lot in the grave slabs also. And at a later stage, they're using the limestone more. It's that extra strip of masonry in the cathedral, raising the side wall there, is limestone. The round tower is limestone, and limestone is just found down. There are big quarries there that were used up into the 20th century between Clonmacnoise and Shannon Bridge. And so and the North Cross is limestone. Now, the two high crosses are of superior sandstone. I'm not sure where it comes from exactly. Some people have said somewhere down near Killaloe, maybe came up on the Shannon that way. But it seems to be a finer sort of sandstone than what was used in the churches. That little temple, Dowling, the original temple Herpen, I suppose it was, has a sort of a mixture of stone. Some of it is limestone and some bits sandstone. So you're getting that, the two different sources, which are quite close, both of them, to Clonmacnoise. But the crosses is still a mystery. It isn't worked out, the two main crosses.
There are 7 churches. It seems an excessive number of churches for a small area, and a lot of them are very small. Were they used for saying Mass at all, or were they all in use at the same time?
There's actually more than 7 churches. There's about 9 or more, and especially if you go down to the nuns' church and its other little church there. The whole idea of 7 churches is just a modern figment of people's imaginations. Quite a few places, Glendalough is the same, Inchclareon, there's quite a number of places where they say there were 7 churches. 7 was sort of a magical number, and they homed in on that. But sometimes there was more, sometimes there were less. Um,
It was always called the Seven Churches.
yeah, but
Why? When did that start?
we don't know. We don't know exactly. The earliest we can trace it is probably, I think, probably 18th, 19th century, but it could be older than that, you know.
Yes, because it was always locally.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody
Oh, yeah.
But
Up to very recently, and even still, some of the older
Yeah,
people would
yeah.
call it
Yeah.
Seven Churches.
Churches, yeah.
there were the 7 churches of Asia Minor.
Yeah.
Christianity.
You've 7 loads of things there. 7, this is the 7 hills of Rome. There's lots of 7 things, you know. It was a magical number, 7. But the different churches you're asking, I think they were associated with different groups or families sometimes. And some of them may have been just used occasionally. Someone died or whatever. But the cathedral must have been the main congregational church, if you like, when the monastery was in existence. And I suppose when the monastery became a bishopric, monasticism seems to have died out, apart from the 2 nuns' churches, I suppose. And sometimes it's said there was Augustinian canons there, but someone has pointed out recently that there's very little evidence for that. And, you know, there's nothing later on at all at the dissolution or anything like that. So I think it moves from being a monastery largely to being a diocesan centre in the 12th, 13th century. And these churches lingered on, I suppose, with different, and there were important ecclesiastical families around who retained a lot of power, like the Malones. I mean, right up to the 19th century, I suppose, they had a big house and everything in Balnahown, and they were an important family. I think the Moonies were another important family, and they would have been connected to some of the churches too, I think.
Establishment.
Yeah.
In primary schools, we kind of teach the children that pre-Vikings, Clonmacnoise was nearly a city, that it had so many monks and blacksmith shops and metalworking shops, and that they would have needed all these churches, and that the monks would have had to celebrate Mass daily. But I don't know, does that coincide with Irish practice, where they were actually celebrating Mass that often? Sometimes you hear that they were hardly celebrating it at all.
Possibly not that often, you know, and sometimes there's mention of a priest, and there might be just 1 or 2 priests around the place. There was a bishop quite a lot, even in the early time too, in pre-12th century. There were often bishops. Would have been a bishop connected with Clonmacnoise, and he would have had sort of power over the other churches that were connected with Clonmacnoise. So he would have been quite an important person, but didn't have control of the lands and the wealth of the place, which was quite often a layman who was descended from or connected to Coarba. He was the follower of the saint. And so some of these were lay, but there would have been a religious element there and a monastic element of some sort surviving, and with a scriptorium and all that sort of thing. But there was a lot of lay people living around as well, craftsmen and all that sort of people.
And there were a lot of students, because Alcuin of York was educated at Clonmacnoise in the 9th century. Or 10th century, 9th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
He served at the court of Ciarán, so they were coming from all over Europe.
yeah,
And then another thing about the churches, there were little churches, outlying churches. Like
Yeah.
down the road to the east, there was a little church. I know because I come from there. And there were 2 circular circles in a field, and they were called the Dervilla, which I think definitely was from Dervilla.
Yeah.
And they had a wooden church there they were taken out of it in the 1970s. And there was rotten wood or whatever in the ground. So I definitely think that's where Dervilla came to first, and then moved further up to Clonmacnoise. It's only a half mile away.
oh, Yeah, Clonmacnoise had what's sometimes called a parochia, a lot of other churches associated. They were quite wealthy, and calling it a city is a sort of a construct of a city of God or something. It doesn't mean it was huge, but it was a substantial settlement. You know, when you're talking about 105 houses getting burnt, and that wasn't all of the site, you know. So
It's mentioned also about a king of Conleth, an O'Connor king, went blind and he wandered around the streets of Clonmacnoise for 12 years or something. But the thing is that everybody called their yard a street back when I was growing up.
yeah,
You know?
yeah,
Even Patrick Kavanagh mentions the street, someone's street in front of the house, and there was a yard at the back. So that could be the streets of Clonmacnoise,
yeah, yeah.
not the streets this way.
Oh yeah, but there were and there's mention in the annals of the building of towers or causeways across the site.
Which
So.
did come back.
And you can still see one of them going through the new graveyard. There are
Yes,
trees
that-
each side of it,
yeah.
and the big stones that form the surface of it. Yeah.
And that Pilgrim's Road that comes right up by the Nuns' Church, I found somewhere in some of the ancient manuscripts that that was laid down in 123 AD. Imagine how old that is. One of the 5 great roads.
Oh, probably part of the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, one of the 5 great roads branched out into Ireland. So that's why Clonmacnoise probably developed there, because it was by that road
Yeah.
and the Ciarán.
yeah. Oh yeah, Shannon. Yes, sort of crossroads in some ways.
But there is a town's land between Ballynahan and Clonmacnoise called Clonmacnoise. And okay, some people say that's Jerry Red Meadows. But I found an old reference that said it was Clonmacnoise, Meadows of the wooden house, which wooden house meant a church.
Yeah.
I know.
Maybe at this stage we'll have 2 chambers. And it's any queries, further queries, maybe I can talk about later.
I now call on Michael to give the vote.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman, Mr. Speaker, pleasure in presenting the vote of thanks on your behalf. I want to thank, first of all, Conleth Manning for coming here this evening. He's no stranger to Tullamore, but that said, we don't see him often enough. He was here, as you said, in the 1980s. I think he was here again in 2014. And he's here tonight. And I think now he got a good run for his talk tonight. With all the questions and comments. I think it was very good. You know, this is how you've made a great contribution to the audience. And in that way you've stimulated Con to come out with a lot more knowledge that he has. That he was keeping for another night maybe. And now he's had to bring it out this evening. So it was very interesting to take the history of the monastery from 800 from the bridge, I suppose, in terms of what Con is looking at, the archaeological remains, and bring it up to the 15th century, to what seems to have been a ruin prior to the Reformation, which would knock a lot of our history books on the head that say that the Tudors destroyed the place in the 1550s. Maybe it was the McCaugheyans did all that damage, and also the fact that the bishop couldn't get in to attend that his work there meant that maybe the buildings were allowed to go to ruin. That's only a simple explanation, but there may be something in it. But it's been a very useful evening. As you may know, some of you were at the Doro talk, which was centred in the early 20th century there last month, but did look back to how people viewed the monastic city in the Celtic period. This was at a Stopford Green and bigger con that were discussed here.
Yeah.
And then we had Rory then has been studying the bishops of Ireland in the medieval period, and he was bringing us to 4 in June. So that would also be of very great interest in terms of the church management and so on of the churches in the medieval period. Con, I think, has to deal with what he finds in the ground. But I think tonight's contributions show that there's a lot more out there, and we need Con and his colleagues to be back in Clonmacnoise. We're sorry that Heather King passed away so early in life. She made a great contribution, and those 2 volumes that Con showed are here in the library. So in concluding, I just want to express our thanks again to Con. He's a wonderful person. He has a great mind of information, and I want to congratulate you on extracting more information from tonight's talk. It did show to me that we could be here for another hour discussing all of this, and to our great pleasure. It's a great thing about history that it is a quarry that you can keep looking at. To use another phrase of the stone, the quarry, that question, where did the stone come from? I just thought of Stephen McNeill, because he was our late president. He was from Bloom Hill. Now, I would have been able to throw the idea that he was an erratic, which he would have very much enjoyed had he been here. Yeah, I won't make a misspelling of it. That wouldn't be appropriate, but erratic would certainly cover. But a lot of interesting aspects to tonight's talk. And you've been very good to us, coming all the way from the city. And it's been a great pleasure to have you. And you've left us with a lot of things to think about. And we do hope that we'll see you here on another day in the not too distant future. So thank you, everybody.